All right. So I hope you don't mind us, this intrusion of that every other week, who is this guy Bible study that we've imposed on Thursday nights. We have one more coming up next week, and then we'll go back to the normal routine, which is what we're doing tonight. We're going through books of the Bible, and we're going to do 2 Samuel. Okay, so if you're visiting, we're just taking little snippets of this and that and stopping at my pleasure to talk about what I want to talk about. So hopefully you'll say, he missed something, and you'll reread 2 Samuel, and that's the goal. But before we even get to 2 Samuel, I wanted to say something about 1 Samuel chapter 30. David has a problem. His men were in Ziklag, and the Amalekites put a raid on his place, and they took captive the women and all who were in it, the small, the great, and they carried off everything. So David and his men, they go to take care of business, they come back, and they've been raided, and everybody's been enslaved, and it's a bad moment. Okay? And so they lifted up their voices, they wept until there was no strength in them, and David was greatly distressed because the people spoke a stone on him, and they were all embittered. Now, I don't know about your situation, but doesn't it feel like that sometimes? You know, things go wrong, and you're weeping, there's no strength left, people have taken something important from you. Could be your self-esteem, your dignity, who knows? You can fill in the blank of what's going on in your life that's not working. And all of the worst is when people start turning on you. Well, I'm just trying to do my best, and next thing you know, people are all against you. And how does David handle it? But David strengthened himself in the Lord his God. The problem, the raid. The solution, turn to the Lord. What problem you have? If it's a problem, I know you think about it all the time. You churn over it. You worry about it. You struggle against it. You battle. Why did God allow this? What should I do? And I wonder if all that time we spent thinking about it, instead we took it to the Lord and turned it into prayer power. I know I've shared with you before, one time I was facing a really big problem, and I was on my knees, and I'm going, Lord, 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 Lord. And I started to try to solve the problem in my head, and I heard him say to me, do you want to handle this, or do you want me to? I said, wow. Okay. I wouldn't have heard that word if I wasn't on my knees. If we aren't in prayer, we're going to miss out on God doing amazing stuff. The biggest, greatest thing for me was him speaking to me. And then he solved the problem, by the way. And notice in verse 8 it says that David inquired of the Lord. And we're going to roll now into 2 Samuel, and we're going to find this over and over and over again. Chapter 2:1, he inquired of the Lord, what should I do? Chapter 5:19, he inquired of the Lord. Chapter 5:23, he inquired of the Lord. He's going through life, and he's asking God what to do. And there's this statement that I hear all the time. Well, you know, God gave us a mind. He expects us to use it. And people usually say that as an excuse for not living in that constant daily conversation with the Lord. And yeah, he gave you a mind, but you know what? When you turn to the Lord, he's going to move through you. He's going to guide your thoughts. He's going to direct your path. He's going to empower you with wisdom. That mind he gave you, he's going to fill it. And so I bring this up because in Proverbs 16:3 it says, commit your works to the Lord and your plans will be established. And what if you and I were living in that close, constant relationship? The other day I'm leaving the gym, and I just look at this woman who's walking my way, and I'm in this prayer zone. And so she looked bewildered. So I said, "Are you trying to go to the emergency room?" Because the emergency room was that way. And she was going this way. And when you go this way, it's a long walk to get over to that way. All of you Celebrationites know what I'm talking about. And she said, "Yes, I am." And I said, "Well, if you're comfortable, I'll give you a ride because it's way over there." So she gets in my car, and I drive over there, and I find out that her mother had a stroke, and we pray in the car for her. And it was just this really cool situation that because I was in the zone, I'm reading the face. And the face was bewildered. I intercepted, and we had this cool prayer time for her mom. Now, I'm not telling you to pick up strangers, okay? She could have pulled out a gun and taken my car, and, I would have been walking to the emergency room. But here's what I'm trying to say. If you live in that ongoing relationship with God, He prompts you. He's going to be the one on your heart, moving you. Well, chapter 2 of 2 Samuel, or actually chapter 1, we find out that Saul and Jonathan have died, and Jonathan is one of David's best friends. And he makes this powerful statement. "I'm distressed for you, my brother Jonathan. You have been very pleasant to me. Your love to me was more wonderful than the love of a woman." Now, of course, people take this all over the place. Well, David and Jonathan, they had a clandestine homosexual relationship, I don't know. I think they were best friends. And in best friends, that's a deep relationship. It can be deeper than your husband and wife relationship. Okay? And it's kind of fun to see how he talks about it in such a special way. Well, here's what happens. I said in chapter 5 that he inquired of the Lord. And this is how God answers him. "It shall be when you hear the sound of marching in the tops of the balsam trees that you shall act promptly, and then the Lord will have gone out before you to strike the army of the Philistines." Okay. Chapter 5, verse 24. So, when you hear the marching above the tree line, I'm moving ahead of you. And I want to make a big deal out of this because going back to whatever problems we might have, guess what? God is working for you. You have access to the almighty power of the living God who loves you, who cares about you, who has the hairs of your head numbered, who knows what you're thinking about. This is the guy that's willing to answer your prayers and bring his amazing, miraculous power into your life. And so when David refreshes himself in the Lord, no doubt what he's reminding himself of is, I've got a God who's going to work for me. I've got a God who can do the miraculous. And I want you to believe in this God because he likes moving in our lives. And I think sometimes we handcuff that movement by a lack of faith or a lack of asking. And I want you to stay there, and I want you to see how God does answer. Now, you remember that weird place where the Ark of the Covenant is being moved, and one of the guys that took care of the Ark, it started to tumble, and he reached out to touch it and keep it safe, and it falls over. He falls over dead. And David gets all mad. God, why do you treat this guy who's only trying to protect the Ark? Everybody gets upset, and when I read that passage, I remember talking to you about it way back in, I think it was Exodus, where God set forth the rules. These people are not supposed to touch the ark. And this is one of the guys who touched the ark. And what's amazing is 400 years later, look what happens. The rules still apply. Not supposed to touch the ark. And he dies. And sometimes we get too cozy. We forget the rules. We lean on cheap grace. I'm going to be forgiven. And, well, Maybe he was forgiven, but he's not living on earth anymore. I bring that up because I want you to hear this. And then David, he gets excited. The ark's brought to Jerusalem. He's dancing before the Lord with all of his might, and he's only wearing a linen ephod. I don't know what it means, but I'm guessing he didn't have a lot on. And so his wife sees this, and she sees David leaping and dancing before the Lord, and she despises him in her heart. He's not being politically correct. He's making a fool out of himself in front of everybody. He's letting his relationship with God get a little bit too much. He's becoming one of those holy rollers. He probably is going to raise his arms in church when worship's happening. And guess what? She tells him about it, how the king distinguished himself today and covered himself in the eyes of his servants as one who foolishly, shamelessly uncovers himself. And David says, you know what, I wanted to celebrate before the Lord. I really don't care what those maids think of me. I'm the king, they're the maid. I only care about what the Lord thinks of me. And I'm not going to let somebody else's opinion get in the way of my relationship with God and my worship with God. And so many of us, we live in fear of somebody else's opinion. What are they going to say? What will they think? I'm thinking, well, who's they anyways? I don't care. I live to an audience of one. That's the guy that I care about pleasing. And maybe it's okay for us to just go ahead and put our dignity aside and have that conversation with somebody at work. Speak to a friend about the Lord rather than just let them go to hell because you never bothered to talk to them. Okay? Maybe it's okay to let our faith loose. And David loves the Lord. The Lord has given him rest on every side of his enemies in chapter 7. And this is what he says. I dwell in a house of cedar, but the ark of God dwells within tents. He wants to make God a temple. This wasn't Solomon's idea. This was David's idea. I'm worried about you, God. I'm in a nice pad and you're in a tent, and that needs to change. He wants to build something for the Lord. He wants to honor the Lord. And you know what's amazing? As we go farther into the scriptures, you're going to see that David, even though God says, you're not going to build it, your son's going to build it for me, David collected money, he collected resources, he collected wood, he collected rocks, he set up the plans. Even though he didn't literally build it, he made it happen because he wanted to honor God. And I'm going to have to remember this verse when we get ready to build that new facility out there, okay? Remind me. It comes a point when you and I need to be building the house of God rather than our own house. When we need to be seeking to honor God rather than just worrying about, am I getting ahead? And I think sometimes when we honor him, he honors us. Well, I don't think that. That's what 2Samuel says. He will honor those who honor him. And especially for us, we live in the American dream. We're the capitalist society of history. And guess what? We need to be thinking about it. Is the kingdom of God being built through my life? Well, it's kind of fun. God and David had this really cool interaction throughout chapter 7. And God's just blessing David. In chapter 8, 6, the Lord helped David wherever he went. Can't you just feel the neat relationship, the blessings? I mean, this is amazing stuff. It's wonderful. And it all comes tumbling down in chapter 11. David's great sin, Bathsheba. At a time when kings go out to battle, David stayed at Jerusalem. And as he's walking around in the cool of the afternoon, he sees a beautiful woman bathing. Who's that? Her name's Bathsheba. Well, why don't you invite her over? brings her over, and it's all bad. You know, at our session meeting the other day, one of our elders said, we are one brave decision away from an important turn in our path. One brave decision. And sometimes you and I are confronted with temptation, like those of us who still have to do our taxes. Okay? Sometimes not easy to have integrity then. Or to fudge on your expense account at work, or do a little compromise here or there. You know, well, one brave decision. And what I've noticed is when you set compromise into motion, it becomes a habit. And you end up starting to rationalize. And you start to have a problem with God because God's saying you shouldn't do that, and you're doing that, and you're living off of cheap grace for a while, and then suddenly you start changing the scriptures because, well, I need to find some scriptural foundation to do what I want to do, and your relationship with God gets a mess. And the decisions in our lives, they dictate our future. And David, he's a guy that has many wives. Instead of just having one, he has many. And it sets up a life of self-indulgence. And when he's not where he's supposed to be, when kings go out to battle, he stays at home. What's that wise statement? Idle hands are the devil's workshop. And here's what I want to say to all of us. I think that our lives get mishandled if we don't have our purpose before us. When we're just doo-dah through life. We forget that I exist for God, that I live to please Him, that I want to serve Him, that I have an agenda that He's given me every day, that we're supposed to inquire of Him. David doesn't inquire here. And this moment, it cost him his integrity. His kingdom is going to be torn apart. His peace is vanquished. His enemies are going to be able to blaspheme him. And notice this is the sin cycle. He sees her and lusts. Ooh, she's hot. Then he covets. Ooh, I want her. Then he takes her and commits adultery, and then she gets pregnant, and then there's lies and deception to cover up until finally he murders her husband. Because he's the king. This is the cycle. And you wonder what's going on in his life. This is what I've learned in my years of the ministry is usually people don't just sin because they're rebellious. Usually there's an inner turmoil going on within them. It's not that we want to defy God. It's more that we're incorrectly responding to a pain in our lives. You know, the Alcoholics Anonymous, they say, be careful when you're tired or when you're alone. I can't remember the other ones. But I know when you get bored, that's when you can be vulnerable. You have to know yourself and know when you're weak and say, this is when I make bad decisions and when I mishandle life. And put yourself in motion so that you don't. Or call somebody so that you don't let go of your principles. Spurgeon said, Lord, let me not fall little by little or think myself able to bear the indulgence of sin because it seems so insignificant. Keep me from sinful beginnings lest they lead to sorrowful endings. Well, David commits adultery with Bathsheba. She gets pregnant. He says, no problem. I'll call Uriah the Hittite. One of his 30 mighty men, I'll call him home and tell him, hey, take the weekend with your wife. Well, he comes home and he says, and he doesn't go home. He sleeps with the servants in David's house. He says, why didn't you go home? He says, the ark of Israel and Judah are staying in temporary shelters. And my military commander is in the open field. Shall I go to my house and eat and drink and lie with my wife? I will not do such a thing. This guy has more integrity than David planned on. He's committed to David. He's committed to the Lord. Well, David does a bad thing. He sends the death warrant for Uriah the Hittite. He says, here, give this to Joab. And so he gives Uriah gives Joab his death sentence. Kill him for me. So he sets him up to get killed. And at the end of the chapter 11, Joab's mad. And David says, don't let this thing displease you. The sword devours one as well as the other. This is what happens with sin. We start to rationalize it. Well, if the situation was different, I wouldn't have made that choice. If God was made me stronger, I wouldn't have sinned against him. People say that kind of stuff. I hear it. And you think, wow, how could David have somebody murdered? I mean, this is a man after God's own heart. God's chosen king, the psalmist, the guy who wrote the Bible's prayer book. Well, I think it goes to show that within all of us are two natures, the sinful nature and the spiritual nature. And the one we feed is going to be the one that determines our pathway in life. How is it that great people like David could commit a sin? I think rather than beating up on David, it's a good opportunity for us to go, wow, if somebody that close to God can blow it, maybe I should be paying attention. And for those of us who've grown up in good environments, we've never considered murdering or committing adultery with somebody. But there's those subtler sins like judging others and being so critical and negative. I mean, those sins are equally damaging to other people's lives. Well, David got away with it, right? Wrong. God saw what took place. She's pregnant, and 9 months later, she has a baby, and got through that problem. Except that one day, Nathan, the prophet, knocks on his door. Says, hey, I want to tell you a story. There was two guys in the city, one rich, one poor. The rich man had a bunch of flocks and herds. The poor man had one little lamb, which he bought and nourished. And it grew up with him and his children. And it would eat the bread and drink of his cup and lie in their bosom. It was like a daughter to him. And then a traveler came to the rich man, and the rich man was unwilling to take from his own flock and his own herd. And he went and took the one man's little lamb and sacrificed that for his traveling friend. When David hears this story, his anger burned against that man, and he said, surely this guy deserves to die. He needs to make restitution fourfold because he has done this thing. And Nathan says, you are the man. Wow. It's kind of funny how what bothers us most about other people can sometimes be the sins that we commit. I think we get blind to our own shortcomings, and we judge others really harshly. And think about Nathan. Sometimes God sends Nathans into our lives. And how do you receive these challenging words? Do you dismiss that person? The Bible says a wise man listens and considers. And too often, you know what happens? Christians don't talk to other Christians because, well, it's easier not to be in that confrontational situation. And therefore, we don't help them see the problem with God. Could you imagine being Nathan? Your job is to tell the king you're guilty. And God says this, I would have added to you many more things. Why have you despised the word of the Lord by doing evil? And because you did this, I will raise up evil against you from your own household. I'm going to take your wives before your eyes and give them to your companion, and he's going to lie with them in broad daylight. You did this thing in secret. All Israel is going to know what you did. And this is how David responds. Off with his head. Don't speak to me that way. No. It's not what he says. He says, I have sinned against the Lord. And you know what happens immediately? This is what the prophet says. The Lord has taken away your sin, and you shall not die. I want you to see who God is. This horrible, sinful situation, this mismanagement that David did, gets forgiven. And I know there are people here who say, oh, I don't think God will ever forgive me. And guess what? Even if you committed murder and adultery, you can be forgiven. Because God's just that way. He loves you. He knows we're going to make mistakes. He knows we're going to break the rules. That's why Jesus died on the cross, to take the punishment that we should have gotten. And God forgives you. Not so that you can get away with it. God forgives you so that you can get a fresh start and do it right. Okay? Well, it's powerful stuff. Out of this, David wrote Psalm 51. A Bible verse that has had power in our lives throughout the centuries. And that came as his response to sin. And friends, God yearns for the prodigal. Christianity is all about the forgiveness of sins. But I want you to see that patterns get set up when we sin. David, he has a problem with lust, and his one son rapes his sister, and then his other son murders his brother, and well, like father, like sons. Okay? Like father, like sons. And here's where the situation gets kind of weird. You see, later on, David's son decides he's going to be king, and he chases David out of the town, and David's close counselor, Ahithophel, says, okay, lie with his wives so that everybody will know that you're a stench in your father's nose. And they'll know there'll never be any reconciliation between you. And why would everybody turn against David and start following the son? Because he committed this great sin. See, he lost his credibility. He lost the power of the kingdom by giving his subjects reason to see shame in his life. Well, Ahithophel, how could he turn on David? Ahithophel is Bathsheba's grandpa. Okay? And here's the situation. I talked about this on Sunday, by the way, if you want to look it up on the internet. But, how could you do this to my family, David? I was your close friend and counselor. How could you sin against me like this? Well, apparently he never let it go. And so we see the Bible coming to fruition, and David's children, it's a mess. As I said, one rapes the daughter, another one kills that guy, and then David's son tries to take over the kingdom, and in his whole life, from that point on, was filled with brokenness. And I want to go back to that one little statement. We're one brave decision away from an important turn in our path. There are defining moments in our lives. You can mismanage it and be forgiven, but we still have to deal with the consequences. The major consequence, taken over on the cross. And many a time the Lord steps in and covers us. Thank God for that. But for David, it's a mess. Well, I'm out of time. There's so much more to say. What I want to do is I want to go to this one place in towards the end of the chapter. David decides that he wants to count how many people come to church. How big is my church? How big is my kingdom? How many people are subject to me? Guess what? It's the wrong thing to do. It's about pride. How great am I? The reason he's great is because God made him great. Our focus is to be on God, not on how great am I. And so David has the census taken. He's got 800,000 Israelites. He's got 500,000 Judeans. And then he realizes, oh, wow, I did a wrong thing. And God calls him on it. The Lord says, I'm offering you 3 things. Choose for yourself one of them, which I'm going to do. Shall 7 years of famine come to you in your land? Shall you flee 3 months before your foes? Or shall there be 3 days of pestilence in your land? And so this is what David says in 24:14. Let us now fall into the hand of the Lord, for his mercies are great. But do not let me fall into the hand of man. Once again, what does David know about God? He's full of mercy. And God puts his hand out, and I think about 70,000 people die. And right when he's about to come to the temple, God stops. And so David builds an altar right there. And friends, you want to know something powerful? That's where the temple is built. The temple gets built where God stopped on the threshing floor of Araniah the Jebusite. This is where Jesus died. How many? A century, a millennia later. Well, I'm out of time. There's so much more that I could say. It's a little bit heavy tonight. It's a little bit heavy, but you know what, friends? It's supposed to be. But we need to take our relationship with God seriously. We get too cozy. We forget. We just assume we're going to be forgiven. And you are forgiven. That's what's so radical about it. But this merciful God, he takes himself seriously. And he wants us to take him seriously. And rather than people being shamed about God because of our behavior, we can turn people around and say, wow, I thought Christianity was a mess, but after watching your life, I think I want to be a Christian.